What's up, everybody? It is Izzy. What I want to do in this video is sort of like a different style of content to the Q&As. So instead of like 30 to 90 second soundbite answers for each question, I'm going to just pick one topic and go super deep into it. So if you're not following me on Instagram, I would recommend doing that because that's how I got to the topic today. I basically put up a box and say, hey, what topics would you guys like to see me cover? And then I picked my 3 or 4 favorite ones, put it on a poll. Everybody voted, and the overwhelming winner for today's video topic was discussing evidence, the evidence-based culture right now in the fitness community, and how it creates blind spots for a lot of people. So the way I want to put this into context to begin with is when I was much younger and still natural and less developed than I am now, less strong than I am now, I used to wholesale dismiss the opinions, anecdotes, experiences of enhanced lifters. And while I was right to do that in many respects, I was missing the point. It wasn't that their information was wrong or bad. It was that it just didn't apply to me as somebody who was sort of weak and a natural noob. Okay? Imagine that somebody comes to you and they haven't hit their first 2-plate bench press yet. And you have another person that comes to you that's trying to hit their first 6-plate bench press and they've already done 550 or 250 kilos. Now, do you think those programs are going to look anything alike with differences in absolute loading that are that significant? Are those people going to do the same number of bench sessions per week? Are they going to use the same exercises to address weak points? Is there going to be the same level of emphasis on hypertrophy work? Are you going to do the same number of hard sets, the same rep ranges? I mean, there's probably very little about those two programs that are going to overlap because those are people who are basically in two completely separate populations as lifters. And as coaches and as lifters, we wouldn't expect the same program to work best for both of them. Optimal programming requires a little bit more specificity than that. Now, here's the thing that I want you to consider with that in mind. Science is actually even more specific than that example that I just gave. Scientific findings they have to control tightly for one variable, right? So for example, let's say we wanted to figure out what's a better hamstring exercise. Is it leg curls or is it the Romanian deadlift? If we use different numbers of sets, we might falsely find that the exercise that we did more sets on is a better hamstring exercise than the other one. Let's say we did more sets of leg curls and leg curls produce more hamstring hypertrophy. We might say, okay, well, leg curls are a better hamstring exercise. In reality, it could be that the reason why we got better hamstring hypertrophy from the leg curls is because we did more of them. So in any scientific process, right, when we're looking at the way that studies are set up, generally we're going to hold as many variables constant as possible. So when we're testing what level of volume works best, we need to hold the rate of progression constant as well. Because if one group is progressing faster than the other in terms of weight added to the bar, repetitions, etc., we might falsely attribute to volume what needs to be attributed to progressive overload. The issue with both of these examples is that in the real world, leg curls are easier to recover from than RDLs. They have no axial loading, they don't tax your back. So you would almost certainly do more volume for leg curls anyway. But if we test it that way, we aren't sure if it's the volume or the leg curls. Likewise, when we're testing volume versus rate of progression, if we allow both groups to progress at whatever rate that they can, in the real world, we would pick the program that allowed us to progress the fastest because that's the whole point. But when we want to know about volume levels, volume only, we have to hold the progression constant to see what level of volume is better. And while that can give us some insight about is more volume better than less volume, it's also in a very specific situation where rate of progression is held constant. And that's not really what we wanted to know. It's almost never what we wanted to know. What we wanted to know is what works best when all the variables are interacting with each other. But that's not how science works because, again, we won't know what's doing what if we test it that way. The second big issue with many of the studies is that the research is specific to the population that you are studying and it cannot always be generalized. So if you actually dig into many of the exercise science studies and look at who the populations are, it'll say this was done on experienced trainees. Go a little further though, and then look at, let's say, the male subjects, and you look at their average 1 rep bench press, 1 rep max, and it'll often be like 200 pounds or 90 kilos. And I don't know what world these people live in, but in my world, a male with a 200-pound bench press is a beginner. He is a novice. Unless he's like 5'2" and 130 pounds or something, it's not even intermediate status. This is stuff that kids do in PE class in high school. No joke, it really is. How when we already agreed that the guy who hasn't hit his first 2-plate bench press should not be on the same program as the guy looking to hit his first 6-plate bench press, how are we going to confidently generalize results of studies like this on college undergraduates with a 200-pound bench press max and say, this is valid for a guy like me who probably has a bench press in the 450 range when I train it? That just doesn't make a ton of sense. There are many more examples like this. For example, they've done research on sedentary diabetics who take metformin. And in that population, metformin decreases net protein synthesis. And this has led some people to say, well, if you are an enhanced bodybuilder who lifts, you should not take metformin. It decreases net protein synthesis. It doesn't, though, in healthy populations who lift. The anabolic signaling from either anabolics or lifting itself is so much stronger than the signaling from the metformin that it's completely washed out. And then the improved insulin sensitivity leads to better progress overall. Another example, HGH was tested in isolation on athletes. And what they ended up finding was, yes, there was a slight long-term benefit to body composition. Most notably, they lost a little bit of fat. There was some increase in intracellular water retention in the muscles. But by itself, HGH didn't notably increase muscle mass and didn't increase sports performance. And this actually led sports governing bodies in the 80s to claim that HGH doesn't work. Absurd, right? Because we know from competitive bodybuilders that are also taking anabolics that there is a synergistic effect between those compounds. And in fact, it's the main reason for the explosion in size that came in the Dorian era and followed with every bodybuilder after that. Again, a lot of these results are very specific to the population being tested, and they're very specific to the conditions that the testing was done under. And this brings me to another larger point about enhanced bodybuilders and powerlifters in general, which is that we aren't tested in the studies. It's unethical to make somebody take substances that could harm their health, right? So an ethics board is never going to let you torture someone and see what happens. And in much the same way, they're not going to let you have someone take steroids because there's negative health repercussions. So anything in the literature usually has nothing to do with direct testing on enhanced individuals. And so at best for enhanced individuals, the literature acts as a guidepost or like a very zoomed out map where maybe you can't even see the roads. It just shows you the general direction that you might want to go. So how does any of this even apply then to enhanced individuals? Well, it applies through practice. Then that's what evidence-based practice means. You take things in the literature and you see how they might be applicable, and then you go and test them in the real world. And they do this in the medical field. The practice part is actually where the majority of the first line therapies are hammered out. Okay, it's not directly taken from the literature. It's when they go and test it on a dozen, 100, 1,000 patients that they begin to develop, this is my preferred way to treat this ailment. This seems to have the highest success rate in the real world. And training is absolutely no different than that. You can get some research that points you in a general direction, but you have to go out and try and see if that pans out in the real world. Now pause, wait a second. How is that any different than what meathead bros do? They hear about an idea from Arnold and they go, all right, you know what? I'm going to try Arnold's shoulder routine. I'm going to try Dorian's back routine. And they keep a training log or a journal or whatever, and they write down what part of that worked well and what part of that didn't work well. That is literally exactly the same thing that the science nerds, no offense, are doing when they claim to be evidence-based. You are taking something that may be a legit signpost, a guidepost to guide you in the right direction, and then you're going and doing the practice part from evidence-based practice to see if it pans out in the real world. Both groups are literally doing exactly the same freaking thing. Okay? There is no science-based training and another training that's not science-based, because none of the research sets up training in a way that is real-world realistic. Look at the Schoenfeld studies that concluded that there was no productive upper limit to volume. You know what they had people do? They had people doing single leg press to failure, 30 to up to 50 sets in a single week. They did it leg press to failure on 60 to 90 seconds rest. Sometimes a dozen sets right in a row. No one in the real world is doing that, okay? If I tried to do a dozen leg press sets to failure on 60 seconds rest, by the 10th set, if I haven't torn my quad off of the bone, I'm probably doing leg press with the empty sled because I got nothing left, right? Nothing left. That looks nothing like real world training. And so it really shouldn't be surprising that the results look nothing like real world results. And in the real world, I don't know a single person that claims you should be doing anywhere near 30 to 50 sets for legs to failure in a week, and claiming that they, even with 50 sets, they probably could have done more and kept getting good results. That's nonsense. And again, because we come back to the population issue as well. Most of these studies are done on 20-something-year-old undergraduates who are, at best, late-stage novices, and calling them early intermediates, even that would be super generous. So I just had this huge issue with people being derogatory towards practitioners who don't pay as much attention to the research, thinking that they're just so much better than them. In reality, all of us are just out here trying shit. We're just trying shit to see what works. It's all trial and error. At best, the literature can cut a little bit of time off of your learning curve and point you in the right direction. But again, whether you're doing RP style of training, whether you're doing RIR training, whether you're doing HIT, whether you're training like Jordan Peters or any of the popular people these days, you are still going out and trying things and taking notes on what works and what doesn't. So we're all on the same team, and you need to be open to the idea that because exercise science is frankly in its infancy still, there's a lot of things that we just haven't tested. And bodybuilders have gotten a lot of things wrong, especially on the explanation side of things. They often have explanations for like why things work. They're just completely wrong, even though the thing did actually work. So don't be so quick to dismiss these people when the reality has always been that the practitioners, the people who are like their livelihood depends on winning shows and building muscle and setting records in powerlifting, don't dismiss everyone that doesn't immediately try to lionize the science, because a lot of these things haven't been tested and they won't be tested. And the reason why is that science does not test things holistically. You will never see a study that tests RP style training versus high intensity training, because that's not what we're interested in. When we are conducting science, through the scientific process, we are trying to elucidate principles, and we do that by testing one little variable at a time. Otherwise, we don't really find out anything that moves the literature forward. But in the real world, we don't care about what happens when you isolate and only change one variable at a time. We are trying to have multiple, dozens even, of variables interact at the same time to create the best result possible. So what's my point? Let me bring this all together. I just would invite some of you to really consider being more willing to try things that aren't yet supported by the literature if they have been shown to work for many different lifters, because that in and of itself is a form of evidence. And in fact, it is, in my opinion, the bulk of the evidence that we currently have, as there isn't that much literature, training literature, to begin with, compared to other scientific fields. And a lot of it isn't real world realistic. So when you're considering what things to try in the real world that are real world realistic, the main source of evidence that you have comes from practice. It comes from trying things, seeing what works, and discarding what doesn't. Because that's going to be your process anyway, just give some consideration to things that don't necessarily have literature support, but are supported anecdotally by lots of different bodybuilders, strength enthusiasts, and just lifters in general. And I promise you, you will see that more often than not, the harebrained ideas from the literature don't pan out well, and the ideas that you get from some dude that's been lifting for 15 years and he tells you, hey, try this tricep exercise, that works like 80% of the time. That's been my experience. Maybe your experience is different. But again, just remember that the literature has very serious limitations, just like anecdotes do as well. And at the end of the day, we're all on the same team, and you have to go out and test things to see what actually works. The literature is not the ultimate arbiter of truth and results in lifting. It's far from it. Trench data, real world results, seeing what actually happens, that is the ultimate arbiter. Hope you guys liked the video. If you want to see more stuff like this, subscribe, like the video if you like the video, questions and comments below, and obviously follow me on Instagram so you can participate in the next Q&A and vote on the next topic for one of these longer in-depth videos. Have a good day, everybody.